Yeah. Well, I had absolutely no background in my family of mountaineering or hill walking or trekking. I was brought up in northeast England in Newcastle upon Tyne, so I'm a Geordie by by tribe, and neither of my parents were interested in the outdoors. They were struggling and trying to improve their lives. And my father was an accountant, and the great thing was that they did not like seaside holidays. They did not like the beach, so they would go take me on a touring holiday in the Lake District or in Scotland, where we would go from guest house to hotel. And that at the age of 7 or 8 years old, I saw the hills and the mountains for the first time, and I was absolutely transfixed by the enormity of it, and the desire to explore and find out what was up there. Things looked so impossibly big and impossibly high at that age. Well, this is hard to say when you're 7 or 8 years old. What, how do you know what it does? But it was the sense that the scale of the landscape and the scale of the world, one just suddenly becomes aware of just how enormous the world is around you. Even you might laugh here thinking that our little hills in Britain could inspire such feelings, but they do. And even the Lake District, which is only 20, 30 miles across, I would be looking up at these hills and see the waterfalls coming down and seeing impossibly high ridges with the clouds blowing across and think, ooh, that looks very scary. It looks awe-inspiring, and I want to explore. So that got my my mind into it. And as soon as I was able, I would start climbing small hills. So I used to go off from my parents if we were having a picnic down by the road. I would say, I want to climb this hill. And after picnic, I would go and climb the hill. My parents would get very worried. And maybe after 1 hour, 2 hours, I would come back down. And that was at 9, 10 years old, I was doing that. So then one is very much influenced then because one is inquiring. So I got interested in the library and getting books out on walking and getting maps. And for me, getting a hold of maps was one of the most inspiring things. The Ordnance Survey maps of the Lake District in Scotland, I collected them. So I would put maps on my Christmas present list at the age of 10 years old. Instead of all the usual things you might think, football books or sports books, I would be asking for maps. And then I would get started on the walking guides, the Wainwright walking guides to the Lake District. And I would be asking for one of those for my birthday each year and building up the set. So I was a bit, I'm afraid I was lost to mountaineering at a very early stage. And then I started to read the books about the great mountaineers and the great books that had come out in the 1950s and 1960s, The Ascent of Everest, and then all the great alpinists' books like Bonnati, Herman Bull, Gaston Rebouffat, and then the great British climbers like Bonington and Willens and Brown. And of course, then one gets aware of a tradition and an aspiration of something that was going to be very challenging to all my energies. So that got my my passion fired up. And then I started walking with scouts, and then at school with friends from school. And it wasn't until I was 16 years old that I was able to get into rock climbing and start using ropes. But I think it's a really useful experience to become a trekker, a backpacker, to learn about the hills and just moving through the hills, learning about camping, survival. And I did that for several years in my teens before I even started rock climbing or mountaineering. So I was lucky enough that my parents could afford to let me travel and buy equipment for me, and it made it a little bit easier for me. So I was studying, so I passed through school, and I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to go to Cambridge University to study geography. Geography, obviously my passion for landscape, maps, it was a natural subject to do. I was quite good at geography. So I got to Cambridge and then joined the mountaineering club in Cambridge and met new climbing partners there. And Cambridge, as you probably know, is in the flatlands of eastern England. And being exiled in Cambridge for 3 years, it would take 3, 4, 5 hours to reach any hill at all. I realized just how important mountains were. So we had a big tradition in Cambridge. I remember that one of the items that the club had in the library were a pair of boots that Noel O'Dell, who of course I think he was a lecturer at Cambridge, geology, and he had donated to the club. And everyone laughed at these boots because they were big tackety boots with nails around them, and they were known as O'Dell's boots. And I wouldn't like to say the purposes that they were used for, but the old chap would have been horrified if he'd known. So we knew there was this tradition, and there had also been a tradition of climbing on the buildings in Cambridge. And a book totally illicitly published about it. So we had this tradition to go on. I met her in a mountaineering equipment shop, a ski equipment shop in Newcastle upon Tyne. And I had a holiday job as a student. Joy was working there, and her brother-in-law was one of the founding directors of Berghaus, the big equipment company. And she had the job there, and that's where we met. So that was when we were 19 years old. So we were very lucky. And it's just so important that if you make these big moves in life, this sort of doing what we did, giving our jobs up, moving to Scotland, starting a climbing school, that you've both got to be committed. And I'm very lucky that Joy loves living in Scotland and always has done. She likes it more than I do, actually. So we were a team working together.
Which route you climbed?
So we made the first ascent of the West Ridge of Neil Camp. That was probably the high point of our new pioneering, because that was a big route and it was quite a technical route. And again, we had 3 clients on it and 3 guides, but we made it, and that was an amazing climb to achieve that. And we also got very interested in the old explorers like Tillman and Shipton, and started reading all the old accounts. And so we got we read about the Badrinath to Kedarnath traverse that Shipton and Tillman had attempted, really. So we found this legend, read the Shipton book, and in fact that chapter was more exciting than the Nanda Devi chapters, because they had an epic. They nearly died. They were very lucky to get out alive. I spent 2 weeks, I think, in the jungle trying to get across the rivers and living on bamboo shoots. And it was just so romantic, this epic that they'd had. So we thought we'd go in the dry season in May, June, and see if we could complete the traverse, because they hadn't reached Kedarnath. They had to go down the valley to get out and survive. And there were 2 or 3 more ridges to cross to get to Kedarnath. And so and I think of all the trips I've done, for enjoyment, that one was the greatest. We didn't climb any major summits, but we went over the high passes. We had to search for a route. That was difficult to find a feasible route, but we found one, and we got down and into the valley. And I'll be honest, because it was the dry season, everything was easier for us. But for our level of abilities, we were out on our own for 8 days, carrying everything for 8 days.
No porters.
No porters. We had one Indian high altitude porter who was part of our team, Sobat Singh Rana. And I remember at one point, after we'd abseiled down the ice and we were thrashing through the jungle and getting our kukri knives out, and he says, "This is not Himalayan trekking," he said. But he enjoyed it, and it was great that we actually had an Indian climber with us on the thing. So I just loved that whole thing. We were a team of 5 that did it, and we had an Indian member. We had another mountain guide, Rita Arklis, a female mountain guide who was very famous in Europe and New Zealand, and then two other chaps. And it was a wonderful trip. So we were having to go up and down, and it was very hard going. I mean, it was 4,500 meter ridge down to 3,000 meters, up again, down. So it was terrific, and it was just a lovely trip. So we ended up in Kedarnath at the temple, and I remember the most beautiful thing at the end was we got to the ridge, and there we looked down after 8 days of not seeing anybody, and there were hundreds of pilgrims, and we could see the settlement and the temple, and there were these lovely snow slopes going down to Kedarnath. It was still only the end of May, and I remember that we glissaded down the snow, sliding down, sort of skiing down towards the temple. It was this great culmination of the trip. And of course, we were pretty hungry by this time as well, so it was great to get there. And obviously, that's the only time I've been to Kedarnath. And of course, now the devastation in Kedarnath was particularly shocking, having been there and experienced it just that once. So ever since then, I've really enjoyed the traveling aspect, going over unknown cols, going from valley to valley. And on a lot of my trips, we maybe climb a peak, and then I say to the guys at the end, I say, well, hey, do you not fancy going over this pass to finish? That would be fun, have a little epic at the end, and just tell the staff that we'll meet them on the other side in a few days' time, and just head off, totally committed, totally alpine style, and just go for it and see what's on the other side. And so it's that feeling of seeing what's on the other side that really inspires, and looking for the comforts that you're going to find down in the valley on the other side. That's part of the thrill of doing it. So I've done a lot of those sort of trips now. What I've done recently, just last year, was when we crossed the Pouting Col between in Kumaon just on the east side of Nanda Devi, going over from the Shalang Valley and over the Pouting Col. We knew nothing about it. We had a few days to spare at the end of the trip, so we instead of just hanging around and getting very bored and depressed at base camp, I said, well, why don't we just see what's over this col and see if we can traverse it? And we had quite an epic, and we took 4 days, just two of us, my friend and I. And we had a real trouble on the other side.
What was the trouble?
Well, on the other side, our map was an old Survey of India map from the 1930s, and it was scale 1 to 150,000. So it tells you nothing. But there was a glacier, and it looked as though the contours, as they were, looked reasonable, but it dropped a long way. It dropped from the col about 1,800 meters, but we thought there'll be a way down. Well, we should know all about things like global warming and the glaciers retreating. We got over the col, and we started going down, and there was an edge, and we got to the edge, and we were a long way down, and below us was just an impossible, broken, jumbled icefall, just dropping forever into the cloud, and we couldn't even see the bottom of it. And it was one of the most scary things I've ever looked down. And we thought, what have we done? How are we going to get out of this? Because now I'm getting old and I'm getting tired. We've got very little food, and we've only got 2 days left. To go back over the col would be very exhausting and wasn't easy. So we either had to find another way, or retrace our steps, or starve. So that's the adventure of being an explorer in terms of going over these passes. And the cloud came in as well. So if the weather had got any worse, we'd have been in real trouble. So we camped there on the top of the icefall and hoped the cloud would clear. And it did in the morning. And I know we set off, and we had to get down that day. But we had good, clear morning, and we were able to traverse across and find an alternative route.
Not through the icefall, but sideways.
On the side.
Right,
So every step of the way, you're thinking, well, if I can't get down this bit, I can't climb up something that I've abseiled down, that's it, we're totally committed. And luckily, we found a way down, and we got down. We took about 10 hours to get down, and we made it. But then when we got home, we thought that no one's ever been over this col. This is a first. We can sing about this. Then when we got home, and I looked through the records, and I got out the book by Tom Longstaff, who was even a generation before Shipton and Tillman. In 1905, he had crossed this col, and he wrote about it. And he had had exactly the same thing. He'd gone over and come to the icefall, and then they'd had to find another way. And so we must have followed a very similar route.
Wow.
And okay, maybe the glaciers were easier in those days, but when you look back at what those guys achieved in 1905, and you're just full of respect and admiration. But that's the spirit of the mountains, and I just hope that we can keep that spirit going in the future, that it's not all siege climbs, commercial climbs, and siege tactics and fixed ropes, that we can have the spirit of climbing alpine style and exploring still. That was another special thing in my mountaineering life, was climbing onto a peak behind Adi Kailash and seeing over the border, and there it was, Holy Mount Kailash. And now I've had that experience twice.
Oh, wow.
On 2014, we had another experience of being up there in the evening, and then we saw the sunset over Holy Mount Kailash. But I think the lovely thing is that I haven't been to Holy Mount Kailash, but it was there. And it was almost as good as having been at the bottom of it, to have seen it, being that close, 60 miles away, and seeing it from the Indian side. So that's enough for me, I think.
When did you write your book?
So I wrote my first book about when we climbed all the Scottish Munros in winter, called The Munros in Winter, which I enjoyed because it was a narrative. Very easy to write narratives when you've done something you enjoy, and you've got a schedule that you can describe. So the progress of the book is simple enough. It's the progress of the journey, and you're just writing about it. So I loved that, and I then was able to write a similar book on when we traversed all the alpine 4,000 meter peaks. We did all the 4,000ers in the Alps in 52 days. That was with a friend, Simon Jenkins, in 1993. And I wrote a similar book, which was a narrative, an adventure narrative of this challenge, which we succeeded in doing. And then I wrote an instructional book about the techniques for winter mountaineering, and about Scotland's winter, well, it's called Scotland's Winter Mountains. And I've written a guidebook to the Alps. So I did a little bit of guidebook writing, which was interesting. Proper detailed guidebook to the 4,000 meter peaks in the Alps. And then just recently in 2014, more of an autobiography of my life as a mountain guide, particular reference to guiding and being a leader and a guide. So that came out, that's called Higher Ground, which came out in 2014. So I've always enjoyed writing. I've always enjoyed lecturing as well. Some people don't like it. I quite enjoy talking to people, and I love the chance to write.